Hey Sam, how's it going?
Hey Noah, how you doing, man?
Good to see you. Thanks for jumping on with me.
Dude, happy to do it. There's plenty to talk about, I'm sure.
Yeah, how have you been? You're going through a big change. I know we've been talking
Yes,
back and forth over text recently, but tell everybody kind of like what you've been doing for the past couple of years and kind of your journey and where you're headed because it's really interesting.
sure. So I went to film school at UNC Wilmington, and after freelancing for about a year in Charlotte, where I'm from, I started working at a place called Element Studio, which is in High Point, North Carolina. It's actually a really cool commercial film studio. And so I worked there for 4.5 years. And I actually just left that job to pursue more freelancing and writing. But at Elements, I really grew a lot and learned a lot. The way I see it is, or at least the way it feels to me, is it's almost like I got paid to get my master's in filmmaking. It was a great first job in the film world. Basically, Elements has a bit of an uncommon setup in the film industry where a lot of us, well, we have specialization jobs there, but a lot of us would sort of do a little bit of everything. So I directed a lot of videos, and I edited even more. Editing is probably my strongest skill set when it comes to production. So I edited a lot of videos, and I was also a camera operator on certain shoots. I was even doing sound a few years ago on some shoots. But mainly in the past few years, I've been specializing in directing and editing and camera operation. And most recently, we did a pretty big thing last year. We did this comedy commercial for clients that involved the use of SAG actors, which none of us at Elements had ever done before.
That's
So
awesome.
I learned a lot about, yeah, just the ins and outs of working with SAG actors. And we're a non-union studio, but with a SAG signatory, that sort of thing happens all the time. So anyway, yeah, it was a great ride at Elements. I was there 4.5 years, and now I'm focusing on my biggest passion really at this point in film is in writing. And so I'm working on some writing and focusing on freelancing this summer. So that's
That's
what I'm up
awesome.
to.
That's super awesome. I mean, that leap is definitely scary, right? I mean, I recently did it myself, just having to manage yourself full time, but just trusting your skills and going for it. And I feel like personally, I'm a lot happier. It's paid off significantly
Yeah.
for me.
Yeah.
And so, how are you kind of approaching managing yourself and like the day to day, I guess?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's funny you asked that. So right now, I'm taking a couple weeks off. Thankfully, I've been able to save up enough that I can do that even for longer than that. But I'm just taking maybe about a month or so off to really focus on writing. I'm trying to finish this pilot episode I'm developing and fine tuning a feature screenplay I wrote last year. But otherwise, so what I've mainly done is I've focused on finishing up my website, getting that to a presentable place. My plan is to start showing that to more people, start getting further into LinkedIn. To be quite honest, I've kind of barely used LinkedIn up to this point, and part of it is because I haven't really needed to use it. Working at Elements, working a 9 to 5 in the film industry, I've just kind of been meeting cool people and connecting with people that way, and I haven't really needed much of a LinkedIn presence. But so I'm getting further into LinkedIn, and I'll probably set up like a production hub account and start just reaching out to people, I guess, more through that way. And of course, networking with people like you and Forrest and other awesome guys we've all filmed with and girls, just people we know always helps too, of course. But that's kind of the general plan. And maybe eventually, maybe this fall or something, just depending on how freelancing goes, I might be looking into trying to just like get some sort of a full-time or part-time editing position at a post house, maybe as a ideally as lead editor, but maybe even as an assistant editor. If the pay is good enough and if the work is interesting enough, I wouldn't mind doing that. That's the funny thing about, I think, our industry is the jobs can be fairly competitive. And I think when it comes to post, I don't know, at least from what I've heard and in my experience, if you want to be a lead editor at like an actual post house, you often have to kind of work your way up through that post house hierarchy.
Right.
Or at least I know of some places that are like that. Maybe not everywhere is like that. Maybe if you have enough credentials. At this point, I can say I've got 4.5 years at a pro film studio on my resume, which hopefully would get me through more doors. But we'll see what happens. I'm still figuring out a lot of this stuff, just like you are.
Yeah, there's so many ways you can approach it, so many different paths. I mean, there is obviously, like you were talking about, the traditional post-house path where you start out as even just a post PA and then you work your way up to an assistant and then a lead editor. I mean, that's the traditional Hollywood route to go. And that's what I thought coming out of college that I wanted to do. It wasn't until, for those listening, that I also worked at Elements. That's how me and Sam got connected and working there. That I realized there's just so many other routes, whether that be commercial or even just being a full-time freelancer or starting your own production company, things like that, that really stood out to me that I wanted to just kind of explore, even for a few months at a time, and see what I really love to do. And I found that I've gone in a completely different direction than I would have thought a year ago, and I'm much happier doing it.
Yeah.
Even if I'd never worked on any giant Marvel movie, whatever, $200 million film, anything like that. I mean, I wouldn't care because I really have found that I like working with people that I enjoy being around, being creative, even if that's on the smallest scale. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, no, it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, I think I'm kind of the same way. I definitely like working with people. I mean, to me, it's always ideal to work with people I really like. And that's another interesting thing about the film industry is because you're often bouncing around from project to project with people you may have never worked with before, I think maybe there's just more... Yeah, it's a bit more of a wild card, both in a good way and a bad way. I just think of some people working more traditional 9-to-5 jobs where maybe they have the same set of coworkers for years and years and years. For better or for worse, it's not like that, in the film world. It's even at Elements, it was pretty stable. A lot of people kept their jobs there for years and liked it there. But, some people would inevitably leave and we would get new employees and so on. But yeah, I'm the same way, man. I really prefer to like the people I'm working with, especially because the artistry of film is such a collaborative art form, and it's important to have a good rapport, I think, with the people you're working with, both just on a technical competence level and also just in terms of the vibe, just liking the people you're with. That's definitely important.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. So you mentioned that you're really focusing on writing, and I know that you're most passionate about editing. How does your approach to writing affect editing and vice versa? I mean, they're very, very opposite ends of production in terms of story writing, but I would argue that editing is just as much of a story writing process as the pre-production process.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on all that?
Oh, I love that question. So, yeah, it's interesting. I guess I've realized that about myself in the past couple of years. I love writing and editing the most, and that's sort of like the alpha and the omega of the film process, the very beginning and the very end. But to answer your question, yes, I would completely agree that editing is extremely important and often an undersung hero. And, there's this phrase that I totally agree with. It's that there are 3 films you make. There's the film you write, the film you shoot, and the film you edit. And oftentimes, even from the best filmmakers like Scorsese or any super experienced filmmaker, they always talk about how things take form in maybe a slightly different way than they expected at the very beginning. As casting goes on, as production design, with cinematography and then visual effects, etc. There's always some amount of chaos in the filmmaking process, which is, I think, part of what makes it very interesting, if at times stressful and exciting. But yeah, I think editing, one of the things that maybe it just appeals to my inner control freak. It's like being able, like when you're involved in the final say of what a film is, I think that's very satisfying. And I always like to think of editing too as using I was really into Legos as a kid. I would
Yeah.
like to make my own contraptions and stuff, and also follow the directions of things. And I really think of editing as like building with cinematic Lego bricks, because you have a finite amount of pieces, like clips and audio and so on. And the idea is you're just essentially using these limited resources to build something that's greater than the sum of its parts. And that's always really appealed to me about editing. And so, but to answer your earlier question about how do those inform each other, it's hard to say. I think I just try to write with the edit in mind. Whenever I'm writing, obviously thinking visually is very important when you're screenwriting. And yeah, and so also screenwriting, this is a whole can of worms I won't dive into, but screenwriting is just a strange craft, because a finished screenplay is its own work of art, but it's also this strange, like, half-done thing, because really a screenplay is meant to be filmed and edited, so it's like, it's not like a novel, you know what I mean, where
Right.
it is a standalone piece. And so yeah, screenplays can be kind of tricky, because you might have really cool ideas for, like, this scene could end on this close-up of this, and the next scene starts with a wide shot of this, but, like, usually you're not really supposed to get that specific with the visuals. Like, you can call attention to a visual that's happening, like this worm crawls along the edge of a knife. You can, like, maybe mention that, but anything specific to cinematography and editing, you're typically not supposed to do with screenwriting. Of course, the idea being that some other director or producer might take this and film it. But yeah, as much as possible, I try to think very visually, and I try to think of what the edit would probably be when I'm writing. So that definitely helps, I think, the writing process.
Yeah, I think that makes great screenwriters. And on the flip side of that, as an editor, reading through the entire script and thinking about cuts and edits, and even if you're involved really on in pre-production as an editor, especially if you're supervising things like that, breaking down the script in terms of what the cut will be has really helped me, and that sometimes influences how they end up shooting it on the day. If you offer any of that creative input from the post side, I had a great mentor tell me that editing is the final rewrite, and
Yeah.
and sometimes whatever you write does not translate to what you shot, which does not translate to what you have in the editing room.
Right.
But sometimes that story undergoes that different transformation because it's needed. I mean, you have different people, involved in all three stages of the process. So sometimes it just ends up being completely different than what you started. But sometimes, most of the
Yeah.
time, I've found it's just even better. You're working out all the kinks in the story, right?
Yeah, ideally it is. Yeah, and I think that just goes back to that phrase. There are three films you make: the one you write, the one you shoot, and the one you edit. Yeah, because between each phase of the process, there is always some amount of the unexpected. And like you said, ideally it's a good thing. Sometimes, like, for example, this is a really random specific example, but I'm thinking of Sicario. Amazing film, Denis Villeneuve, Roger Deakins shot it. I've read the screenplay, and I love Taylor Sheridan as a writer. The screenplay is very good. It's also a lot wordier. And what's interesting is, like, with Denis Villeneuve as a director and some of the actors, they decided that their dialogue could actually at times be a little bit more sparse. And so there were certain lines, and this sounds like a writer's nightmare, maybe, but there were certain lines that the actors and director decided weren't quite needed to be said. And because sometimes less is more. So that's an example of how things can change up. And then in the edit, I think maybe there was like one deleted scene. I could be wrong there, but yeah, the edit is the final rewrite, like your mentor said. Yeah, and one interesting thing I've come across recently with this big SAG production we did at Elements last year was I almost think of editing as the invisible actor in a way, because with the right editing, and this is going to sound mean, you could even take, like, maybe a mediocre actor or mediocre performance and make it pretty good.
Oh, it's
With,
so true.
Music is a big part of that, and also just the pacing. And that's what's so. I would almost be curious to interview an actor about this very thing. Like, I wonder sometimes if they think their second take was the best, but the editor uses their fourth take or whatever. But either way, the editing is the final performance for the actor. So that's a really interesting process too, you know.
Yeah, no, that's definitely correct. I mean, I was fortunate enough to meet Anne Gorseau, an amazing editor of huge Hollywood films. And she was telling me a story. I asked her that same question. Was there ever a performance where you really had to do all the work in post? And without missing a beat, she immediately said, Tom Cruise.
Wow, really?
Yeah. Well, it was in, Outsiders. He was a kid. It was one of his first performances,
Okay.
and so, I mean, that's definitely understandable. But it just was crazy to me. She said that kid did not know how to act.
Wow, yeah.
But she said it
That's hilarious.
She said it so smoothly in this like nice French accent, and so it just like she just. It was just funny.
Dude, that's funny. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. I mean, I know, and some actors, this is a whole side conversation, but obviously some actors and directors work in very different ways, and sometimes an actor, whether the director wants it or not, sometimes an actor will even give sort of a shotgun blast of a performance where they try out a lot of different things. I think Joaquin Phoenix has that reputation for giving a lot of, and sometimes this is a great thing for an editor and director, is like giving just a lot of variety in how they say a line in different takes. But yeah, ultimately it falls on the editing to piece those performances together into like a cohesive character, you know? It's such a fascinating concept.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it definitely is. I still think it's my favorite thing to do. Something about it, I guess jumping back to what you said, I've used that same metaphor for years. Instead of Legos, I always talk about, a puzzle. It's just all the different takes or all these different pieces. And what's interesting is sometimes you get two different puzzles and you have to figure out how to make one image out of them with the different takes and the different shaped pieces. But my brain just has always worked that way to where I can immediately imagine where those need to go. And so I think that's just really served me well. So
Totally. No, and I think you're great at it. And yeah, no, I think puzzle solving is definitely part of it. And yeah, I think, what's funny is like, I know several people, even in the film industry, who are very talented at what they do, whether it's costume or camera or whatever. And they're like, man, I could never be an editor. And I think it's not so much that it's like so insanely difficult. I mean, it can be. It's a very technical craft. But I think a lot of editing comes down to a certain mindset. I think you have to be the kind of person who likes to solve puzzles or play with Legos or just sort of like take these pieces and figure out how to best fit them together. And it takes like time and patience. And although to me, and maybe this is just, I'm just an editor from birth in a way, I don't even think of it as patience. Like, I mean, sometimes an edit can be a little frustrating, but
right.
For me, I just find it intriguing. Like that puzzle solving process you're talking about, like, yeah, and just the different cheats and magic tricks you can perform. Sometimes, it's as simple as literally like cutting to a reaction shot of someone that wasn't meant to be a reaction shot to bridge the smash together of two different takes. Like, whatever that is. It's fun to just find ways to make two things work. And I think a great thing to mention too is split screen cutting, like what David Fincher uses sometimes, if you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
That's a fun editing trick too, and obviously it helps if you're using locked off shots. But I forget the exact phrase. Isn't it called split screen cutting or something like that?
Well, you can also apply hidden cuts. I mean, there's a really really good one in Gravity where she's taking off her suit. It's kind of like they call it the womb shot, where it's all the cords are coming out. It's they built this whole rig, and it was done with CG, but they had just a piece of the suit that floats across the frame that wipes to another cut that allowed that just allowed a better performance. And so
Right.
there's just so many different ways that you can do it, right?
Yeah.
Whether that's CG or just with a wall in the foreground to just like split up a shot. I mean,
Right.
it's so much fun. Like there's so much that you can do, and I mean, like there's also to being an editor a totally technical side to it as well. Like yes, there's that creative like, does this performance work better? But there's also so many technical things to an NLE
Right.
to how you export even deliverables, things like that, like numbers and data that you have to know how to do.
Oh, yeah.
So it's definitely a crazy job that I don't think gets enough credit, at all.
Oh, I agree. Yeah, and in a way, I'm like kind of okay. Like I don't mind. I'm not necessarily a big spotlight kind of person. Like especially writing and editing, those are usually, well, maybe writers get a little more attention than editors, but I don't know. I'm kind of okay with like the actors and the directors being in the spotlight personally, but yeah, I agree. It just in general, I think most people don't notice how hard and how brilliant a good edit can be. And what's interesting too is I've always thought, going back to production though, I've always thought editing and cinematography were very intertwined in any good movie or show. And I kind of personally believe in, I think this is Roger Deakins' philosophy, is that you can have a really beautiful shot or a really cool camera movement or a really interesting montage edit or whatever, as long as it's serving the story first. That's how I tend to think of it. Because sometimes in a lesser movie or show, I think a shot might be like almost ostentatiously beautiful, or like a camera move might be kind of come out of nowhere. And sometimes I think the worst way to do it is when the editor or cinematographer or whoever else is sort of being overly flashy and almost distracting from the story. And I think like, and Roger Deakins, I think, has pretty much said this in his podcast, like sometimes the best cinematography is invisible. And that's kind of how I feel sometimes about editing, at least when you're watching a movie or show. It's the kind of thing that if you're really paying attention to the edit, you might notice how great it is. But, I think it's ideal when someone's watching something that they're just completely immersed in the story and that every aspect of the filmmaking process just services that. That's what I think is ideal.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, some of the best cinematography is not just in plain sight and doesn't just scream at you. It's just masterfully done.
And I think some exceptions for Deakins, some exceptions would be like Blade Runner 2049. And it's all about the style of the piece too. Like for something like Blade Runner, that's supposed to have bold cinematography that like just sort of kicks your ass immediately. But when you think of something else like maybe Prisoners or Shawshank Redemption, like usually I think the cinematography, you can notice it, but it's there to service the story. And I feel the same way about editing. I think for editing, the most flashy editing tends to be montages. I think that tends to be the thing that even your layperson will be like, whoa, that's crazy cool editing. But sometimes it's just a matter of how you intercut a conversation between characters. And it might be completely invisible, but brilliant editing,
Yeah, definitely. Is there anything that you've been watching recently that made you think that, or that you just stood out to you at all?
It's a good question. It's funny, we're talking about invisible editing, so maybe nothing that's jumped out. I will say I've been rewatching Breaking Bad for like the fourth time, and that's just, I think, a masterclass. I just recently watched a show called White House Plumbers on HBO, which is about the guys who did the Watergate break-in. And I thought that was really good. And probably a similar thing, I thought the cinematography and editing worked really well together. It's also cool too, I think, in editing, and this is how I think directing and writing and editing are intertwined. When something is like more subtle in its style, or when something is more bold in its style, like so like for example, 127 Hours. That's a movie that has lots of like montages and lots of like flash cuts and a lot of almost like sort of thematic kinds of interludes, and that can be fun too to do. It's all about the style that I think a piece is going for, and just servicing that style.
Yeah, sure. 127 hours straight out of Forrest Chilton's book. We discussed that last week just because.
Oh, did you? Yeah.
That's his favorite movie of all time. That's a good one.
Oh,
I need to rewatch it.
He's got a tattoo of that one. Yeah, it's a great one.
Yeah, but cool. Well, besides writing, is there anything that everybody should keep a lookout for? I'll definitely make sure to link all of your information down in the description so that people can check you out.
Sure.
Is there anything somebody listening to this should keep a lookout for that you got coming up? Any exciting projects?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that. Hopefully, within the next year or two, my immediate goal will be to try to get an agent for writing and just try to start selling scripts. So hopefully, one of those. But otherwise, I think in the immediate future, I'll just be focusing more on freelancing, which is probably mostly commercial stuff in the immediate future, but hopefully more creative stuff too. But yeah, it's mostly that. I'll mostly just be working in the background, trying to keep polishing these scripts and get them sold. So hopefully in the next couple of years, that'll be a thing.
That's awesome, man. That's definitely a long game with script writing, right? It's it's a process.
Yeah. And that's a whole other conversation, and I know I imagine you're probably trying to be mostly editing focused of this episode. But yeah, it's an interesting process. It's sort of like a hurry up and wait game. You could work on a script for 4 years, try to sell it for 5 years, and then it finally gets sold, and you can make a pretty decent chunk of change or not. And then there's television, and so some writers will literally win an Oscar for their screenplays, and then just sort of like disappear for whatever reason. Maybe they sort of retire from writing or whatever, and other writers will make solid money and a name for themselves in television for decades, and they're never a household name, and they're just kind of cruising in the television world. So there's a lot of ways to go about it, and then sometimes you'll have someone like the Daniels. That's another one to mention real fast, is Everything Ever All at Once, which one of my favorite movies of the past few years. Everything Everywhere blew me away in pretty much every department, and that's definitely noticeable, flashy editing,
right.
All those montages and costumes and stuff. But yeah, their story, I was listening to, there's a really great podcast called Script Notes with John August and Craig Mason that I love to listen to. It's more writing oriented, and they had the Daniels on. And I think you might appreciate this too, Noah, because I know you love editing, and I know you love visual effects too. That's the world they come from. A quick summary is like they went to film school together, and one of them was more directing oriented, one of them was more visual effects oriented, like he knew After Effects really well. And the Daniels, they just started making like weird experimental short films with like, there were a lot of absurdist humor, and which goes hand in hand with visual effects, I think. And you can watch all their short films like on YouTube or whatever. They're like 5 minutes, most of them or less. And they started doing music videos. So like, Turned Down for What? Have you ever seen that music video?
Yeah, they started doing all of LMFAO's music videos, yeah.
Yeah, they did that one. They did some music videos, and then they did Swiss Army Man, which is crazy, and then they did Everything Everywhere All at Once. And it's interesting how many different paths there are to get into the filmmaking process.
Yeah, they have very distinctive styles throughout all of those projects that you can see referencing each other. I mean, if you look back at any one of their music videos, it's very apparent, like, that similar style in Everything Everywhere All at Once. I walked out of that theater and I said, that's going to win Best Editing. That is going to win.
Right.
But
oh yeah, dude, it was amazing. Yeah, and I think not just for because again, I think for editing, the most flashy, noticeable thing is a montage, right? And like, yes, the montages are awesome, but even just again, sometimes the best editing is just a conversation between two people that is paced in just the right way. It's like, I know people would call it frame effing to be more non-explicit, like literally sometimes taking these two shots of like characters talking and moving a clip over like a frame or two can just create this different feeling and tension, and you know, that's the invisible editing that I think is important, as well as the crazy awesome montages, and they did all of that so well.
Even simple tricks that editors have used for decades. I mean, you cut out a singular frame when somebody pulls the trigger and the gun fires, and it just, you feel it, you know, when you're watching it. You feel the impact of the gun more.
Yeah,
there's
for sure. And you know what? This is a bit of a throwaway thing. Keep this or leave it in the podcast. I've noticed this in sound design. I think we've mostly talked about visual editing. In sound design, I've noticed this, and I can't not notice it, and it kind of bugs me. So much of the time in cinema, when someone's about to fire a gun, or there's about to be like an explosion, the background audio will just dip down to like very, very near silence right before the explosion or the gunshot to like really, I think, highlight the intensity of that sound. Mm-hmm. But I always notice it now. That's one of my pet peeves, actually, in cinema, is like that little dip in background noise. I always notice it, and so maybe they could just do it more subtly or something.
I know. The more you work in this industry, the more you notice those little tricks, and it does take away from the magic a little bit, because you're like, wait, I know how they did that. But at the same time, there's one of those films that every now and then that just like you just get lost in it, and you just completely are immersed in it and still enjoy it. And I'm still glad that I can still have that, even, you know, this far in. So
right. And another quick thing just to mention, I don't know, we're maybe running out of time. Another quick thing to mention is that for the movies where they're meant to look like oneers, like you mentioned, Gravity, like 1917 and so on, what's cool about the editing in those is like the editing might seem simpler than it actually is, but it's actually still pretty complex, and it's actually even more tied into the production process. Like, so for example, on 1917, the editor, like, they would literally shoot like maybe a 12-minute long take with lots of explosions and choreography and a lot of moving pieces. And literally the editor that day would be looking through the different takes and choosing the best one that fits with the one before it in the movie. And literally production would be waiting on the editor in those cases to choose a take, because literally like the take would end in a certain angle with a certain view with a certain amount of people in the frame and so on, and like literally the production could not start in some instances until the editor and the director chose the take they were going to use, and then they would set up the choreography and all these logistics based on what the editor had chosen. Which is kind of crazy, because usually it's not, the production isn't that on top of the editing, but it can be, which is a really interesting concept, you know.
I'm biased, but I think it should be.
yeah. I mean, yeah, I could see that. Although it does apply probably a certain pressure to the editing, like a very intense time pressure. But I would be down for that challenge. That'd be pretty interesting.
Well, Sam, thank you so much for doing that. This was such a good conversation.
Man.
About the industry and specifically post-production. I really appreciate your time, and I really wish you luck. You're not going to need it, because you're just going to kill it out there doing it on your own. So,
yeah. Well, thank you for having me, Noah. It's been an awesome conversation, and I love how this is literally the kind of way we talk just in general, and we just happen to be recording this one.
That's what I thought. I was having so many conversations with people all the time just about these things, and I thought, why am I not recording that? This is what just a podcast is like. So.
Yeah, dude. Well, thank you for having me on board, man, and I look forward to the next one. I'll talk to you later.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk to you later, Sam.
All right, man. Take care.